Welcome to Diverse Perspectives, Empathy in Action. This evening, we've come together for an interactive conversation on trauma-informed care. This event was organized in collaboration with a previous Shelter Movers volunteer and current UBC Med student, Dan Lin, to facilitate knowledge sharing from our community partners. Our goal is to deepen our understanding of trauma-informed care and its application in each of our respective roles within the community. I would like to take a moment to acknowledge the land that I'm joining this meeting from, which is Surrey. So I'll be acknowledging that I'm on the ancestral, traditional, and unceded territories of the Semiahmoo, Katsi, Coquitlam, Kaikait, and Tawasin First Nations. As a white settler on these lands, I recognize the importance of acknowledging the Indigenous people and their elders, past, present, and emerging, who have stewarded this land for many generations. Acknowledging the land is an act of solidarity and commitment to work towards dismantling the systems of oppression that have denied them their rights to self-determination. It is a recognition that Indigenous peoples continue to face challenges rooted in historical injustices. As we engage in discussions around trauma-informed care, we must confront the legacy of colonialism and continue to work towards reconciliation and healing. If you're comfortable, please feel free to share the Indigenous land that you're joining from in the chat. If you're not sure, I encourage you to use the link that I'll be sharing in the channel in 1 second to see what the local Indigenous community is that you're staying on. Moderating this discussion this evening is Lillian, who is a dedicated volunteer with Shelter Movers Vancouver, who has been facilitating orientations for the past 3 years. Lillian will be leading the questions to our wonderful panelists who will share their insights and unique perspectives on trauma-informed care. We want to hear your thoughts during this session, so please submit your questions either in the chat or in the Slido link that will also be found in the chat. Thank you, and now it's to you, Lillian.
Yeah, thank you for that introduction, Shauna. So I'm Lillian, I'll be your moderator for this evening, and we want to welcome you to tonight's panel discussion on trauma-informed care in the context of supporting survivors of gender-based violence. So throughout tonight's conversation, I encourage all of you to actively engage with our panelists. Whether it's sharing your own experiences or submitting questions, your participation will enrich our dialogue and contribute to a more comprehensive understanding of trauma-informed care. Okay, so we're going to dive into our discussion. First, we'll hear from each panelist about their specific areas of expertise before exploring broader questions that invite responses from multiple panelists. So first, I'll introduce our esteemed panelists who bring a wealth of knowledge and experience to tonight's discussion. Oh yes, also, if you have any questions that you want to write down, we have a Slido link in the chat with the participant code. So if you write those down, we can collect the questions at the end. Okay, so first I'd like to introduce Anniken, whose professional journey has evolved through pelvic floor physiotherapy, somatic psychotherapy, and education. Anniken is the founder of the Cheerful Pelvis Clinic, where she focuses on trauma-informed care and mindful relationships with clients. Anniken, thank you for joining us tonight. Yeah, so, sorry, I think I missed what you said. Would you like to say it again?
Just a thank you, and it's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you so much for being here. Yeah. Okay, so first I'll give you a question about your own specific experience. So what motivated you to specialize in trauma-informed pelvic exams? And how do you ensure sensitivity and empathy during these examinations, as well as in general interactions with clients that have experienced trauma?
Well, the motivation, honestly, was when I moved into pelvic health from general orthopedic physiotherapy. There is just a huge amount of trauma in that population, and it's more at the forefront of what these patients and clients are sharing with you. We see a lot of birth trauma, medical trauma, and sexual trauma with the things that we treat. And so I didn't have a choice necessarily. As an orthopedic physio, you can get away with not thinking about trauma, not that that's appropriate, but your hand isn't forced. And when I started treating pelvic health clients, it was coming up so much, and I realized that I was just grossly underskilled in that area, and had a really hard time as a healthcare provider without having those skills, taking it home with me, taking on that emotional load. Struggled. And so I found that there weren't really any resources for me. So I went to the therapy profession to get some skills. And that really, really improved my practice within the scope of physiotherapy, and also really, really gave me some skills to feel better at work and to self-care with treating these complex clients too. And so that was my journey, and the clinic. The Cheerful Pelvis came out of that, realizing that we really needed a hub where that was the forefront of what we were thinking about, both for the healthcare providers and for the clients coming in. So it was a personal struggle with those clients that sent me on that journey.
Wow, yeah, thank you for sharing. It sounds like you're filling a really critical gap with the intersection of that mind-body connection almost. Yeah, that was great to hear. Thank you, Anniken. All right, next we have Amy, who brings over 20 years of experience as a lawyer with a focus on domestic violence policy, legislative issues, and training. Amy's leadership roles include serving as the founding chair of Vermont's Domestic Violence Fatality Review Commission. Amy, we're honored to have you with us tonight.
Yeah, thanks very much for having me.
Amy, could you share a specific initiative or program that you've led that promoted trauma-informed care and survivor-centered approaches within your organization or community? How have the lessons learned from that experience influenced your approach at the BC Society of Transition Houses?
Okay, great. Happy to do so. The BC Society of Transition Houses is the umbrella organization for all the emergency shelters for women, self-identified women, children and youth fleeing violence and at risk of violence. And gender-based violence is the primary cause of women's homelessness in Canada and British Columbia. And for women and children facing violence, access to affordable housing can provide a safe alternative to this perilous home environment. And this is not a small percentage of women. And the numbers in BC, based on our research, demonstrate that only 4% of women experiencing violence who come into the transition house supporting system move to affordable housing after using our emergency anti-violence transition houses. 21% find some form of housing, and the housing is often beyond their means, insufficient in size, and financially unsustainable. And the remaining 75% of women continue to be temporarily sheltered or return home to their abusive partner due to the lack of affordable housing. So our society decided to try and look at the issue of housing and how we could design survivor and trauma and violence informed housing models for these folks who are so precariously housed. So we focused on women-centered and trauma and violence-informed housing design and best practices in navigating the development of housing models that actually meet the needs of women and their children. And it sort of coincided at a time when the province of British Columbia was investing in affordable housing. So we wanted to make sure that the housing that was built for this particular population met their needs. So after doing a lot of research, the Women-Centered Housing Design Toolkit was born, and it was a co-creation process engaging women with lived experiences of violence who came into the transition houses in consultation with developers, architects, and housing providers. And it produced a design toolkit with design solutions and strategies that are trauma and violence informed. And so it's very inspiring. It lives on our website, and you can go there, and it's entitled the Women-Centered Housing Design Toolkit. And it addresses what is trauma and violence-informed design and sort of intersectional design to meet the needs of women and their families, and also to sort of meet all ages and all populations. So that was sort of something where we identified an issue and a need, and then tried to put together a toolkit that hopefully will be useful moving forward to develop housing. And the amazing news about it, and this really wasn't my work, it was my colleagues' work, was that it was just recognized by the Canadian Mortgage Housing Corporation as the 2023 Housing Research Award recipient. So as a knowledge to action award. So that's really what we're all about, is taking knowledge and shifting it to action so that we can make women, children, and youth survive and thrive moving forward in affordable housing. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you for your response, Amy. That was excellent. I'm definitely going to check out the toolkit later on. I see Shana has conveniently put that in the chat for us as well. Okay. Our third panelist is Lisa, who has dedicated 23 years to the YWCA, advocating for women and children who have experienced violence. Lisa's leadership and participation in various committees have been instrumental in shaping trauma-informed care within the community and at the YWCA. Lisa, it's a pleasure to have you here.
Thanks. It's wonderful to be here, Lillian.
Lisa, can you discuss a specific committee or initiative that you've been involved with that has directly influenced your advocacy for trauma-informed care within the community or at the YWCA? How have those experiences shaped your approach to supporting survivors?
Yeah, I think generally speaking, working with survivors of intimate partner violence since the mid-1990s made me very receptive to the principles of trauma-informed care. They just make sense to me. But one aspect of it where I had some learning to do was around cultural safety, which is so important, such an important part of trauma-informed care. And an initiative that really influenced me was back in 2009 when I worked on the YWCA's Mothers Without Legal Status project. So this was a project looking at the needs of women who have no legal status or who have precarious legal status in Canada, who have children with Canadian partners, and who are experiencing abuse from their intimate partner. So these are people whose partner wouldn't sponsor them or was constantly delaying sponsorship to maintain control over them. And before the recommendations from this project were implemented by the provincial government, people in this situation couldn't even access income assistance. So it was financially incredibly challenging, if not impossible, for them to leave. And at the same time, they were prevented by family law issues from taking their children back to their country of origin where they could legally work and may have family, friends, or other support systems in place. So really caught between the Canadian immigration system and the family law system. And the project involved research, advocating for policy changes and creating policies for YWCA Monroe House, a second stage transition house in Vancouver, to support women in this situation. We had thought of basic aspects of trauma-informed practice, foremost being really transparent about why we were doing the project, how the data we gathered would be used, and then doing what we said we would do with that data. And we had anticipated that participants in the study would need translation services and emotional support. But we found that other than the women who were already connected to Y services, it was challenging to find people to participate in the study. And there were reasons for that we'd already thought of and tried to mitigate, like trust issues after experiencing ongoing intimate partner violence, fear that we might report them to the Canadian government and they might be deported without their children. But one of the things we really hadn't thought about was that some women had fears about interacting with systems because of traumatic experiences with systems in their country of origin, including abuse by police, doctors, social workers. So we reached out to Vancouver Lower Mainland Multicultural Family Services, who already had established relationships with a lot of women with no or precarious legal status, and we sought their advice and support. And I became more aware of the importance of cultural safety and introducing this concept to our services generally. So basically, a culturally responsive trauma-informed approach is about acknowledging and respecting cultural values, beliefs, and practices, reflecting on our own cultural biases, and very importantly, deep listening to what the newcomer, or in some cases, Indigenous folks that we work with need, and creating policies that reflect what we're hearing. And I do want to just acknowledge briefly that we have the Maori people of New Zealand to thank for the concept of cultural safety. They developed it in the 1980s in the context of the health sector in New Zealand. In the case of the Mothers Without Status Project, cultural safety meant hearing that many of the women with no or precarious status needed to be the ones to decide how they felt safe and how they communicated with us. We needed to be okay with women communicating with us through an intermediary from their community and never talking to us directly. We needed to hear that our practice of wanting real names for the research but using pseudonyms for the report wasn't good enough for some people to feel safe. We needed to let them decide from the very beginning what name they wanted to give themselves and for us to use. And we needed to be less attached to our questions and more open to things that the women participating wanted to tell us about what they were experiencing and their perceptions, which were framed through their own cultural lens. The lessons from that project really stayed with me, and creating culturally safe transition houses and long-term housing is a constant work in progress for us at the Y.
Thank you so much, Lisa. Yeah, it's great to hear about your approach of listening to survivors, and especially that cultural safety. That segues us nicely into our fourth panelist, Parmvir, who works as a family counselor at DiverseCity Community Resources Society in the Refugee and Immigrant Specialized Experience Program, otherwise known as RISE. Parmvir's frontline work involves providing mental health support to vulnerable refugee populations with a focus on trauma, migration, and gender-based violence. Parmvir, we're grateful for your presence tonight.
Thank you for having me.
So, Parmvir, in your experience, what are some effective strategies for building trust and rapport with newcomers who may have experienced trauma or face significant barriers to accessing support services? Could you provide some specific examples where you used these strategies and they were successfully applied?
Definitely. So as you mentioned, kind of in my background, the work we do in the RISE program deals with vulnerable refugees. And when we say vulnerable, we mean refugee clientele that have had poor access to health care, whose families have been torn by war, who have no sense of finances coming into the country, and multiple other barriers that make it even difficult to communicate, such as a lack of English. So a lot of, or the entirety of my work is done with case specialists who do the settlement case management piece, while I do the mental health supports piece, both individually and in group basis. So having for language-based, first language-based service is already one barrier that is removed when we're talking about establishing trust and rapport, especially if you have someone who identifies in the same culture. I find that sometimes that is a barrier because you're so unfamiliar with who you're talking with. There's a sense of familiarity that arises when you see that someone has a shared cultural background. So to further establish the trust and rapport, looks like a lot of trauma-informed practices, such as not being questioning in terms of interviewing. We know that a lot of the clientele that we deal with have very damaged relationships with the government officials and people of authority. And when I think of this, I think of a lot of our clientele from Afghanistan who come, and as we all know, has been overrun by the Taliban, and their lives have been in danger, and they fled here to safety. And their government before that was untrustworthy because of the occupation of the United States, of course, among other factors that made them feel completely persecuted by the government and the Taliban regime that came in. So interviewing, questioning, knowledge gathering is something that might intuitively seem to us as a tool to better understand their situation, but to this clientele might seem like you might want to discover something about me so you can use it against me and potentially end my life or my family's life. So instead of that, we allow them just to share their story, already be aware of the persecution that they've been facing, and allow them to really express the toll that their migration journey has had on their mental health. A lot of that is also done through faith-based healing. A connection to faith allows our bond to be strengthened with them, because we have kind of a communal understanding or mutual understanding that we're here for their well-being, and a large part of their well-being is hope in God. So that goes a long way in allowing that trust and that rapport to be established. As a specific example, I remember a gentleman who was describing his journey, his migration journey, which if you heard it, you would think it's a plot in an action movie of some sort, but it's a reality for these people. We're talking about evading people who are actively on the hunt to end your life because they know you have ties with the Canadian government, and having to sneak on airplanes in the middle of the night, crawling through trenches. And I apologize if this is triggering for anyone, but this is the reality of the clientele we face. And like that gentleman per se, allowing him to express the hardships he went through, unbiased, no judgment, allowed him to recognize that we're here to listen and to help, and not to instruct or dictate how he's supposed to heal. So I think that as a specific example went a long way for me to really understand how we can work with the clientele to help them not only with their mental health, but also their settlement-based needs that they need here.
Thank you, Parmvir. That was really powerful to hear. Okay, so now we're going to delve into some broader questions that invite responses from multiple panelists. We're exploring key themes such as integrating trauma-informed approaches, collaborative efforts to address trauma manifestations, centering survivor voices, adapting care for cultural considerations, and addressing challenges and opportunities in advancing trauma-informed support services. So for the following questions, I invite any of the panelists to respond. Here's the first one. What are some practical strategies for integrating trauma-informed approaches into existing services for survivors of gender-based violence? Feel free to unmute your mic. Of course, yeah, go ahead, Lisa.
Just some very basic things. The first one is being self-reflective. So I think it's really important to take a look at your policies and procedures and ask, why are you doing the things you're doing? Are they necessary? Are they trauma-informed? If they're not, how could you make it trauma-informed? And one of the things that I always find really useful is having practicum students. In the transition house, we often have practicum students from like UBC social work, for example. And not only are they learning the latest theories, but they want to know why you're doing the things you're doing. And their questions make me more self-reflective. But every year, just as a practice, we sit down and we go over our policies and procedures and we ask ourselves those questions. One thing that you've already talked about too is listening, getting feedback from the people using your services. And I know it's really common for people to do things like anonymous surveys, but I also think it's really good when you're starting a new service to have facilitated meetings with people who are already using your services. For example, when we're building long-term housing, we will have a facilitated meeting with survivors living in our existing housing and ask them what's working and what isn't working. And even something very basic. People told us what isn't working for them, or dark, narrow hallways are really triggering for them. And so in one of our new buildings, we built double wide hallways. They're really bright. And we've had such amazing feedback from women about how much safer they feel. And then just very practical thing is there are so many external groups that will come in and do training. And I'm going to give a shout out to Amy and the BC Society of Transition Houses. They had a cedar blankets project to support transition houses to develop culturally safe spaces and practices for Indigenous folks. And these are the sorts of trainings that we can all bring into our services to make them better.
Thank you, Lisa. Yeah. Really interesting to hear that, like, even something that we don't normally think about, like the width of a hallway, can be important to recognize. Okay, let me just see here. Does anyone else? I see, Parmvir, you've unmuted your mic.
Yeah, if I may, just very briefly
Yes.
add to what Lisa said. Uh, in the clients that we deal with, our staff does at least, when it comes to gender-based violence, we're given a training called Roots of Safety, which is adapted from a model in Australia known as Signs of Safety. And the general premise around that is establishing safety for clientele who have been victims of gender-based violence. And it really empowers clients to create and define what safety means to them in order for them to dictate how they want to heal. So as opposed to traditional safety planning, which has its own value and is still needed, it's the idea of how can we identify, label what is actually causing the danger and from where the trauma stems from, and how can we scale how much of that those traumatic symptoms come up based on the dangerous environment and trauma they're subject to. And based off of that, what practices do they feel that are appropriate for them to execute in the moment based on their level of comfort? So it's not necessarily simple as do X, Y, and Z to be safe, but based on your environment, based on your past history, based on the abuse you've experienced, what does safety look like, and what is within your means to slowly reach a level to make you continuously safe? So that's kind of a training that that we received at our organization at DiverseCity, and it was made team-wide for the entire team. And I think the implementation by our organization is also a step in effectively practicing trauma-informed safety planning. So I thought that was just relevant to share.
It definitely was. Thank you, Parmvir. Oh, I see Anniken's also unmuted her mic.
Thank you. I love those two shares. Lisa, I'm going to take that annual policy review and implement that for sure. I was going to share from personal experience that there are however many policies and trainings we work on and we will always make some mistakes with patients and clients. There'll be what's safe for one, just as Parmvir was saying, will not be the same as what's safe for someone else. So I think in terms of a practical strategy that I think is really important is being okay with getting it wrong and just repairing. It's all about the repair and being a constant learner in this, because it's trauma-informed is not like a checkbox. Okay, now I'm a trauma-informed physio, right? It doesn't work like that. So again, leaning into the self-reflection, it's being okay with getting it wrong, fixing it, being open enough that hopefully that the person will tell you if you made a mistake with them. You're really winning when that happens. And then learning and then understanding that that's not personal, and don't take that on, but just fix it, right? And move forwards.
Thank you, Anniken. Yeah. All right, that brings us to our next question. So, what collaborative efforts have you been involved in to address the physical and emotional manifestations of trauma among survivors? And how do you ensure that the services are accessible and inclusive for all individuals, especially those from marginalized communities? So what collaborative efforts have we seen in this context?
I'll jump in and just, if that's okay, Lillian.
Absolutely, yeah.
So,
Thank
and
you, Amy.
I'll pick up that thread that Lisa talked about, which was our Cedar Blankets project. And this was a collaboration with our members and also a local Indigenous consulting firm, Reciprocal Consulting, because our members were supporting Indigenous women, children, youth that were coming into the transition house portfolio. But what we identified is that they were leaving sooner than our non-Indigenous folks. And we identified that we weren't meeting these folks where they were at in terms of providing sort of a women-centered and a trauma and violence-informed approach to take into account their social factors and contexts that shape their experiences. So we had the good fortune to get some federal funding. So it was a 5-year project funded by Women and Gender Equality Canada, and it was aimed specifically at identifying that collaboration and that issue and reduce barriers for Indigenous women and their children accessing transition houses and safe homes across the province. So we piloted it in 4 pilots across the province, all on different Indigenous lands. And really it was all about how we make our support services more heart-centered, women-centered, family-centered, child-centered, and to not make assumptions, and to really learn from the community and also improve our support services to ensure that they were trauma and violence informed, and that Indigenous families felt comfortable coming in and staying, and to develop that culturally safe space and practices. And it's the fun part about it was not only did it engage in sort of local community engagement and network building, but it also brought us this wonderful wise practice of creating an Indigenous advisory circle for all the pilot sites that we've now incorporated here at the Society at the governance level. And we're really encouraging other organizations, and probably some of these folks on this call have them, but we didn't. But it's really to listen to people and to be culturally humble, and to practice cultural humility to create safe spaces and conversation. So it was a successful project, and we're very proud of it. Yeah.
Yeah, that's fantastic news. I'm glad your project is going so well.
Yeah.
I see Shauna has also linked to the Cedar Blankets project in the chat if anyone would like to explore more about that topic. Thank you, Amy, for your response. Okay. We can maybe move on to the next question then.
Could I add one thing to that?
Oh, sorry. Yes,
sorry,
I
just
missed.
wanted-
Sorry, I missed your icon.
I
Please
just
go
wanted
ahead.
to build a little bit on what Amy said, because having adequate housing is so important to feeling safe and to healing, but we do need to make sure that that housing meets physical and emotional needs of trauma survivors. And again, I'm going to talk about a project that the BC Society of Transition Houses did that I was on the advisory committee for. It was the Building Supports, Promising Practices for Supporting Immigrant and Refugee Women Leaving Violence. And it had some really practical advice for transition houses. But there's also something that's happening right now that I just want to talk about in case anyone wants to get involved in it. It's the settlement sector and the nonprofit housing sector in BC, led by AMSA and BC Nonprofit Housing Association, is creating a housing strategy based on the recommendations from AMSA's research around the needs, challenges, and successes experienced by the settlement sector when it comes to housing immigrant and refugee peoples. And I'm going to be on that advisory committee, and they're going to be making recommendations before the provincial election. So it's a great time to get involved in that.
Yeah. Thanks for thanks for flagging the building supports project, because the other part about that project, which was really special, was that we had survivors and women with lived experience as part of that project. So they really their voices were instrumental to the success of that project, and really gave us information that we would never have known but for them sharing their wisdom and experiences. So yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thank you for sharing. Yeah, it's really great to hear about like collaborating with survivors, not just not just providing service on your terms, but on their terms. So yeah, that's our collaborative efforts question. So next, we've spoken about this a little bit, but if I will ask this question in case we have more to share on the topic. Can you speak to the importance of survivor voices and experiences in shaping the development and implementation of trauma-informed practices within your organization or your field of work? maybe any specific experiences that really emphasized for you the importance of listening to survivor voices? If not, we can move on as well. That's totally fine.
I'll do a very quick one. It relates to particularly family law matters. So the majority of the folks who our portfolio supports are often involved in family matters that tend to be very challenging, and they're often representing themselves in those matters because of a lack of representation and legal aid dollars and time. So we received some funding from the Attorney General's office to actually do focus groups across the province for women with lived experience who had gone through the family court process. And we just put together a report and we just delivered it to the Attorney General's office, and hopefully the voices of those women, which were very, very powerful, will inform the modernization of the Family Law Act, which is something that they're in the process of doing. And they were just very, very powerful. And it's so important to have those voices. And we did some online, virtually, we did some in person, and Lisa supported us with them. And we had on-call counselors, we had childcare, we had honoraria, we had all sorts of supports in place to allow for women to participate. And they were very brave, and hopefully their wisdom will inform the Family Law Act so that it will actually become a trauma and violence informed process, as opposed to the challenges that folks are often facing when they have to go to family court to resolve really, really difficult, challenging matters as self-representing litigants. So, thanks.
And as someone who found participants for that project, I just want to say that they all felt really heard, that it was so important for them to know that their story was going to help change the situation for other women in similar situations in the future.
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, thank you. Parmvir, I saw that you unmuted your mic.
Yeah, I thought it was relevant just to share, in our case, in the history of the program that I've been involved with, of how our programming changed, and it was shaped based on survivor voices being heard. And the example that comes to mind for me is a pilot project that we started called Together Now, which was a specific space for a very niche group of people of color who are refugees and also identify with their sexual and gender identities LGBTQ+. We trialed that because it was very difficult for recruitment, as the vulnerability behind people to share that they identify a certain gender, a certain way, their sexual orientation, it's very intimidating, especially if you come from a country and you're a vulnerable refugee who would persecute you for identifying as such. So after trialing that, it got traction in which they were, and they still are, or we are rather, allowed to share that voice and their experiences and their hardships in a group format, and very open group format, where they feel just welcome to share their experience, not even going into treatment in terms of mental health counseling and therapy, but just as an open conversation circle. And that project that was trialed eventually, good fortune, received funding that's now transformed into more case management, because people saw the need for that. So I thought it was good to just put that plug in as a way of showing how far it can go when you really allow people to share their voice, and it just spreads, and it allows so many other people to be helped, just to give that non-judgmental space.
Thank you, Parmvir. Yeah, I see Shauna has linked to more information about that in the chat as well. But definitely from personal experience, like the intersection of being like LGBTQ plus, and then being from like a particular cultural ethnic background, um, there's definitely some like extra barriers at that intersection. So yeah, thank you for speaking on that. Okay. My next question for our panelists, can you provide some insights into how trauma-informed care practices can be adapted to address cultural considerations, particularly as we just mentioned, so BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, and other people of color communities within your respective organizations or fields of work? So insights on trauma-informed care for cultural considerations, and especially for people of color. All right. I know we've definitely heard some, or oh, sorry, Anniken, did you unmute your mic?
Well, yeah, I was just going to say, there are so many, with our efforts with this, they've been challenging because our profession is inherently generally really privileged people end up in the physiotherapy profession. So I think while we're, again, just speaking from my own experience, I think it's really important to acknowledge that if you're not culturally informed, try and find a provider that is, if that's important to the person, have that conversation with them. And if you can't find a provider that is a cultural match for them or a language match, have the open conversation. Or what do I need to know? I'm sorry that you need to educate me, but I'm open to learning how I can best help you given the limitations that I have, and making that effort, having that conversation, because better than ignoring the elephant in the room, right? Have that conversation, but find them somebody appropriate if you can see that there are limitations with your own insight and practice.
Thank you, Anniken. Yeah, definitely, definitely important to listen to survivors and like meet them where they're at. Parmvir, I see you've unmuted your mic.
Yeah, just to add to what Anniken's saying, it's I mean, I love the movement of advocating for cultural competency training in our workspace, and I think it's totally necessary in our field and in our work. I do think to go one step above that, it ultimately looks like educating, empowering, and incorporating and hiring people of color into these positions. I don't think I think without that step, there's a big missing piece. I do, like, as a person of color myself, I've had experience time and time again as a mental health professional of clients coming to me to really express how much it means for someone who looks like them to be treating them with these services from a place of complete understanding, especially since previously when they would have gotten such services, they just didn't feel understood or heard. And if you have someone with a similar or same cultural background, that barrier is quite easily removed. So that also looks like advocating for social justice and equity in the workplaces we are. So everyone has that equal opportunity to deliver that service and to do that work, challenging stereotypes and biases and power imbalances that we might see in our workplaces that might interfere with that service delivery, and being open to traditional practices of healing that might not be as thoroughly researched just because we haven't had the opportunity to, because a large in part of the education we're given is coming from a Western lens. As a person who uses cognitive behavioral therapy, for example, as my primary modality of therapy, I'm beginning to realize more and more that sometimes culturally, that puzzle piece, it just doesn't fit. And there needs to be a cultural adaptation, whether that draws from faith-based practices, whether that means a little bit of more directive approach. Because as you see culturally, especially from the East, it's very much so direct, more directive in the nature of how we deliver the service. And sometimes that's what's needed. And if we don't hear that, then we can't implement that. So I thought that was just necessary to incorporate based on what was asked. But I'm very grateful that we're seeing more and more of that. I have the best manager on this planet. She's not here right now. And she's a person of color and she gets it. And had I not had that, I don't know if I'd thrive into the professional that I am, and be able to give the service that I do to other people of color. So it goes a very long way.
Thank you, Parmvir, for speaking on that. Yeah, as a person of color, I definitely feel like I'm more comfortable with someone who has that personal experience, even though it is still like so important that if you're of a different cultural background, to have that humility and that like open listening, as Anniken mentioned. There is nothing quite like that personal experience, in my opinion, or from my experience. All right, that brings us to our final prepared question here. So, looking ahead, what do you see as the most pressing challenges and opportunities in advancing trauma-informed care and support services for survivors? And how do you plan to address these challenges and opportunities?
I think that as a society, we've really embraced trauma-informed care. And I think that in terms of staffing of second stage transition houses in the sector I work in, staff are always open to getting more information and training about it. Our biggest obstacle, honestly, is funding. We can't serve all of the people who need to access transition houses and long-term housing for survivors of intimate partner violence. And many transition houses are struggling with staffing issues right now. We need more places and people to provide those trauma-informed services. At the YWCA, we're constantly building long-term housing so that we have a place for people in first stage and second stage transition houses to transition to, so that you can take new people coming in. And it's becoming increasingly difficult to do that because of the costs of construction, the costs of buying land. We're trying to get around that by having partnerships with developers, by building on top of city projects, like we have housing on top of a library, housing on top of a fire hall. But really the biggest obstacle is funding right now, not a willingness to transform the way we do the work.
Thank you, Lisa. Yeah, definitely good to know that there's like people want to do the thing, but we just need that funding. Would anyone else like to add on to this question? The most pressing challenges and opportunities in advancing trauma-informed care for survivors?
I'll hop on to Lisa's affordable housing concern. So our organization, we do a 24-hour census every year where we take a snapshot in time of the services provided across the province in the Women's Transition Housing Supports Program. So that's the Safe Homes Transition Houses, second stage, third stage, and long-term housing, sort of the whole capture. But in terms of the emergency shelters, what we found in terms of the capacity issue that Lisa just flagged is that in November of 2023, when we did that 24-hour snapshot, that our folks were able to shelter 1,750 people within that time frame, but 371 people were turned away because of capacity issues. So just sort of get, and that's, you know, and on average, our portfolio is supporting something like between 18 and 24,000 people a year. So the need is great. And there are investments by the province in affordable housing, but it's not enough. And what you want to be able to do is always have a place for a person to go. You don't ever want to have to say, I can't support this person because there isn't capacity to do so. So yeah, the need is significant. So we'll continue to do the advocacy that we do to flag that need, and to work on projects like the housing design toolkit to build additional housing and to work with our members like the YWCA to do that, to increase that capacity. But the other thing I want to flag is that there's also, we're seeing an increase in the lethality of the violence of the folks coming into our anti-violence circumstances. And within that 24-hour snapshot, there were 300 of the 1,750 people that were supported disclosed being threatened lethally in the near, you know, just recent past. So, and there's the femicide rates have increased in British Columbia and also in Canada, and significantly, and the statistics now show that there's one femicide every other day in Canada. So the severity of the violence is very concerning, and the increasing severity of the violence is concerning when you don't have the capacity to fulfill that need. So so we'll continue doing our advocacy to raise that issue, and because that's the reality of the work, but we want to make sure that everyone always is able to be sheltered when they need to be sheltered, when they're fleeing violence or at risk of violence.
Thank you, Amy, for sharing that with us. Okay, so as we approach the end of our panel discussion, I first want to thank our esteemed panelists for their insightful contributions and our audience for their active engagement. So we have a lot of questions submitted here, and we now have some time to get to those questions and answers. So feel free to submit your questions through the chat or raise your hand if you'd like to ask a question live. Yeah, so we'll just continue.
I have some questions from the Slido. Do we want to touch on those now, or do we want to address those after questions right now?
Yeah, I was just going to say the Slido questions. Okay, so here I have some questions submitted from people who have registered for the event. So just checking in with Shauna, what would you prefer done first?
Let's ask one of the questions that was from the people that have registered, and then ask one of the questions from Slido.
Fantastic. Okay. So here we have one of the registered attendees questions. So how can we enhance acknowledgement and support for survivors of legal abuse within the court system, particularly those affected by harm caused by former partners, given its significant impact on many women? So how can we best support survivors, particularly in the context of legal abuse? Yeah, Lisa, go ahead.
So one of the things we've done at the YWCA is hired our own internal family law lawyer to represent women who are staying in our transition houses who can't get legal aid or whose legal aid hours have expired. And the reason for that is that a lot of abusive people will use systems to continue the abuse, and the legal system is one of them, along with MCFD, for example. They'll use the education system through the children to abuse. But in the context of the legal system, sometimes they deliberately run through someone's legal aid hours so that they have none. They'll pretend, for example, that they're willing to look at coming to a mutual agreement, and then they won't. They've used all the hours up, and now she's unrepresented in court. By having a lawyer with unlimited hours to support, and of course it's limited to women in our transition houses, but that unlimited legal support is really important because it means that she always has representation if she's dragged back to court as a form of harassment. And I really like that legal aid has brought back the family law clinics so that women who've experienced intimate partner violence can access that. I'd like to see unlimited hours for these situations, though. I think that would be really useful. The other thing just to think about is trauma-informed law. So there's a lawyer named Myrna McCallum who has done a lot of work on this, and River Shannon, who's the YWCA's lawyer, has done some work with Myrna about that and written some articles. If people want to look those up, they're excellent.
Fantastic, thank you. So I'll take a question from this Slido deck here. Let's see.
Can you see it, or would you like me to read them out for you, or read one out for you?
I believe I can see it.
Okay.
Okay, yeah, but thank you, Sarah. So, okay, here we have a question asked 48 minutes ago. How and where did you learn to provide trauma-informed care? Are there any resources in particular you would recommend? Anniken?
A healthcare question? Yeah. Well, for one, I don't think there's, in terms of at least like pelvic exams, we don't know what a trauma-informed pelvic exam is. Like, there's been no research. We've asked no trauma clients, that question. So it's all us trying to figure it out. Like I said, I went into therapy training to learn more about trauma, to bring that back into my physiotherapy practice. I don't think everybody needs to do that. I think, so I don't think there's like a course or like a tick box to, for that. I think the main things is that it's not, we tend to think that trauma-informed means getting consent. And I think one tip would be, sometimes people will say yes and their body says no. And you should, if the body's saying no, then you follow that. And you open up the conversation and you back off, right? And consent one time doesn't mean consent another time. And so it's really important to be present and attuned with the client and make sure that you're not in your head doing your pelvic exam. And so that's something that is a skill that you work on over and over as a healthcare provider, because we're not taught it in school, right? We're not taught it. And so that's a case of being self-aware. Am I really present with this client? Am I really doing what a trauma-informed pelvic exam or healthcare approach would be for this particular client? And am I working on my open listening and my communication skills enough so I have the confidence to have a conversation with them when I start to feel that something's off? Because it can be very tempting, because it's, in healthcare, it's sort of embedded in patriarchy and we're the experts, right? So it can be very tempting to just like keep plowing through and get your job done. So I think it's just being really, really mindful and present moment to moment about, and if you feel that you're losing that client and they've stopped making eye contact with you or they're tensing up, then you stop and you have a conversation. It's my best advice. I think.
That's really insightful. Thank you, Anniken. Okay, so I see we're at 7 p.m., which is the end time for this event. So as we conclude our event, I want to extend a heartfelt thank you to everyone who has participated. Your engagement and thoughtful questions have enriched our dialogue and deepened our understanding of trauma-informed care and its vital role in supporting survivors of gender-based violence. A special appreciation goes out to our esteemed panelists for generously sharing their expertise and insights with us. Your dedication to this important cause is truly commendable, and your contributions have been invaluable in shaping today's discussion. I also want to express gratitude to all our attendees for their active participation and commitment to learning more about trauma-informed approaches. Your presence here today underscores the collective effort needed to create supportive and inclusive environments for survivors. As we move forward, let's carry forward the knowledge and insights gained from today's discussion and continue working together to advance trauma-informed care and support services for survivors of gender-based violence. Thank you once again for everyone who has joined us this evening.
For those who want to stay behind and answer more Slido questions, just because we actually have 7 more questions submitted, if you want to stay behind, please feel free to do so.
Yes, definitely a lot of active engagement, which is really great to see. So definitely we have more questions if our panelists have the time or ability to stay and answer them. Okay. I will go look at the questions then. Okay, so one of the questions we have here, what key factors do you believe have the most impact on patients when delivering trauma-informed care in healthcare settings? So, for example, a key factor could be asking open-ended questions about comfort or the language you're using to talk to them, things like that.
Yeah, I think, how can I give this some structure? I think I think the language is really important. Questions are important. I think it's as well, it's like an EQ attunement thing where knowing that what we can fall into with language and trying to be really informed is that we can sometimes just give all onus to the client. And for some clients, that's the best thing for them, and that will make them feel safest. And for some clients, they will feel safer with you taking the reins a little bit more, right? And they'll feel safer with you taking that more, so they have the sense that I've got you. I'm the professional. I know what I'm doing. I'm not going to hand it over to, I'm not going to hand everything over to you if you want me to handle this, but I will hand everything over to you if that's what feels safer to you. And so it's really adapting, really trying to get a sense for what that client needs from you as a provider in terms of approach, and adapting your approach and your language to that. And that's sort of like, it's almost like different healthcare provider identities you can have depending on what that client needs that you tap into, and being aware of what your biases are around that and where you feel safer, because you'll tend to go where you feel safer, especially if you're maybe overwhelmed with the trauma that somebody's sharing with you. I don't know if that answers the question, but I think just again reinforcing, going beyond just being really, really self-reflective, as Lisa said, and as Parmvir said, understanding what feels safe for that person, open conversation, reading them, and making sure that you're breathing and you're in your body and you're sensing what's happening in the room and how they're feeling, not just trying to get the answer to the question, on your form.
Yeah. Anniken, can I ask then, are there like specific questions that you ask at the beginning of like a session with a client? Like, would you prefer that I take the reins more, or let you take the reins more? Any like specific questions that you're asking the client to like figure out what they want?
Sometimes I'm that direct, absolutely. Mostly if I'm meeting someone for the first time, you get a sense of, when you ask them what brought them in to see you, do they want to tell their whole story? In which case they're really wanting to share and take up the space and have all your attention be on hearing them out. And some people will just give you, well, I have pain when I have sex, and they don't want to tell you anymore. And they sort of, it's letting them set the tone and then just following that. And maybe there is a big story, but that might come out in time. So sometimes I'm that direct, and maybe I'm that direct a little bit more if I feel like I'm not getting it right. and I'm like, and I'm not sure. And then I might say, can I just check in? Let me give an example here. I might say to somebody, do you have a sense of what you want to get out of this session? And like I was saying, as in response to the last question, some people will say, well, will you tell me? Like they were hoping that I would give them some reassurance answers. And some people will have a very clear sense. So when I ask that question, I might always give a caveat that says, I have some ideas that would help you that I'm confident about, but I want to hear from you. Do you have a sense of what you get out of this? So I'm covering sort of both bases with people, and then I'm learning, and based on how they're responding, which way I should go.
Thank you. Yeah, that sounds like very practical advice for people in a healthcare setting. Okay, so we'll move back to a Slido question. Let's see. What are modifiable risk factors we can collaborate with patients on to help patients relocate when they are not safe? I'm not 100% clear on what this question is asking exactly. If anyone who's still here would like to, like if the question asker is still here, they can clarify more, or if this question is clear to one of our panelists, please feel free to respond. So what are modifiable risk factors we can collaborate with patients to help patients relocate when they are not safe?
I didn't ask the question, but I'm assuming that it means how can we tell when we're interacting in, let's say, a clinical setting, that a patient is under distress or maybe at risk of some sort of violence, and how are we going to modify the situation that they're in to relocate them into, for example, the transitional housing that we spoke about today?
Thank you, Denlin.
I think it's wonderful that healthcare professionals are aware of intimate partner violence and that they're open to supporting people who disclose, but I also think we have to be a little bit careful about our expectations that people are able to or ready to relocate to something like a transition house or some sort of other form of living where they're separate from their partner. People who are in abusive relationships are very aware of the fact that if they leave, that may be the most dangerous time for them. Statistics show that the first 2 years post-separation are when there's most likely to be extreme escalations in violence and even murders. So they are constantly gauging if it's safe for them to leave and trying to find ways that they can get supports without their partner knowing and without him escalating. So I think we have to be careful about those expectations and let them decide when it's the right time, and just be clear that if you need support, here are the places you can get support. And the BC Society of Transition Houses on their website has a list of all the transition houses in British Columbia. If people call 211, they can let them know which shelters or transition houses have space. There are a lot of support services like battered women's support services that can help people who, even before they've left their abusive partner. So I think giving them the information, but letting them pick the time and how they leave is really important.
Thank you, Lisa. Okay, I think just to be mindful of our panelists' time, this will be our very last question. So, yeah, so how do you prevent burnout in your practice? So we all work, or all our panelists work in like this sector that can be quite traumatizing to deal with or stressful. How do you prevent burnout in your practice?
The risk of talking too much and taking up too much space. I recommend Vicki Reynolds to anybody who wants to learn more about that. She talks about how we're not being burnt out by our clients, we're being blown up by the systems, basically. It's that we don't have systems that are supporting people who are experiencing intimate partner violence and poverty even. And so it makes it very challenging for those who are supporting people, because the right resources, the resources people need, are not necessarily available. And it makes it feel, and this isn't exactly what she says, I'm really paraphrasing here, but it makes it feel like you're trying to empty the ocean with a sieve, right? And for me, the thing she said that was really meaningful was about taking part in larger movements for social change, so that you don't feel like you're helpless anymore. So when I join a committee on something, when I am part of a study which is going to recommend changes to government, when I'm doing advocacy on larger issues, it makes me feel like I'm changing the situations that are so impossible, that are making me feel, or the women that I work with feel, burnt out. And I really encourage all staff in my organization to, what committees are you interested in joining? What advocacy work are you interested in doing? Are you interested in working on a research paper? I think that's really important.
Thank you, Lisa. And I see Shauna's linked to more of Vicki Reynolds' work in the chat. All right, so that will bring us to the end of our event today. So as we conclude our, sorry, that's what I said before. But thank you once again to our panelists for generously giving your time and your insights to this event. And thank you all the attendees who have engaged with these topics today and submitted questions and listened with an open mind. Yeah, thank you so much.
Thanks very much. Be well, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye. Take care.
Thank you. Have a good night.
Thank you. You too.